The day Emmett Corra walked into the lobby of Halcourt Properties, he was wearing his good jacket, the dark green one Ellen had bought him the Christmas before she got sick, and carrying a manila folder he had spent 3 evenings organizing. He had not come to make trouble. He had not come to raise his voice or make demands. He had come because the contract between his small welding and fabrication shop, Corra Industrial, and Halcourt Properties required him to submit a structural assessment report by the 14th of the month. And it was the 14th, and this was the place, and he intended to do things the right way. The lobby of Halcourt Properties was the kind of space designed to make certain people feel small. Glass ran floor to ceiling on 2 sides. The floors were a pale stone that caught the afternoon light and threw it back at you. There was a reception desk, long, curved, unmanned except for a young woman in a headset who did not look up when Emmett pushed through the door. He crossed the floor and stood at the desk and waited. She finished whatever she was doing, lifted her eyes briefly, and said someone would be with him. Emmett said that was fine and stepped back to give her room and waited some more. He had been running Corra Industrial for 11 years, out of a converted garage bay in Sault Ste. Marie. It was not a large operation. It was him, 2 full-time fabricators named Gord and Phil, and a part-time bookkeeper who came in on Tuesdays. They did structural work, repair and fabrication for mid-size commercial clients, custom metalwork, the occasional consultation on load-bearing retrofits in older buildings. Emmett had his Red Seal certification, his engineering technologist designation, and 18 years of field experience before he ever put his own name on a business card. He had built the thing carefully and without shortcuts, which in the trades meant something. In the world of Halcourt Properties, it apparently meant nothing at all. The contract had come through a procurement contact, a referral from an architect Emmett had worked with on a heritage building retrofit in Sudbury. Halcourt was expanding a warehouse facility on the edge of town and needed a structural assessment on the existing load-bearing framework before they could permit the expansion. Emmett had done the site visits. He had done the calculations. He had written the report, had it reviewed by a licensed engineer in his professional network, and had it ready 4 days before the deadline. It was a thorough document. It was an honest one. That, as it turned out, was the problem. A man came across the lobby about 12 minutes after Emmett arrived, not to greet him, to intercept him. His name, Emmett would later learn, was Donahue, Brendan Donahue, Director of Acquisitions and Project Development at Halcourt Properties. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, the kind of man whose shirt never seemed to wrinkle, whose handshake was calibrated to a precise degree of firmness. Enough to signal authority, not enough to seem like he was trying. He said he understood Emmett was there to submit documentation. Emmett said yes, the structural assessment for the Kinnear Road facility, as outlined in Section 4 of the Services Agreement dated. Brendan Donahue held up one hand and said they had received Emmett's preliminary notes, and that frankly there were some concerns. Emmett said he had not submitted preliminary notes. What he had submitted, through the procurement portal 3 days earlier, was a preliminary site summary as required under Clause 7. The full report, this one, was the deliverable due today. Donahue said that was all well and good, but that Mr. Halcourt had reviewed the preliminary summary and felt the findings were, he paused here, not aligned with the project's direction. Emmett stood with the folder in his hands and let that sit for a moment. He asked what that meant. Donahue said it meant that the report, if it reflected the same conclusions as the preliminary summary, might not be something Halcourt was in a position to accept at this time. Emmett said the report reflected what the structure could carry. That was what he had been engaged to determine. Donahue smiled the kind of smile that does not involve the eyes, and said perhaps it would be better to schedule a meeting with Mr. Halcourt directly to discuss the scope of the findings before anything was formally submitted. Emmett said the submission deadline was today, he said. Rescheduling a formal deliverable past a contractual deadline without written agreement from both parties would constitute a breach on his end, which he was not willing to accept. Donahue looked at him for a moment, as if he had said something quaint. Curtis Halcourt appeared from a hallway to the left of the reception desk at 20 minutes past 3. He was a large man, broadly built, the kind of physical presence that fills a room not through hostility but through sheer mass. He was 61 years old, and he had spent 40 of those years accumulating properties, developments, and the kind of influence in a mid-sized Ontario city that accumulates quietly, through favor and proximity to the people who sign permits and approve plans. He did not extend his hand. He looked at Emmett the way you might look at a scheduling conflict, an inconvenience that needed to be resolved quickly so you could move on to more important things. He said Brendan had explained the situation. Emmett said he appreciated that, and that he was there to submit the structural assessment report per the terms of the contract, and that he would like to do so through the appropriate channel, so the submission was properly logged and time-stamped. Curtis Halcourt looked at the manila folder in Emmett's hands, and then looked at Emmett and said, very calmly, that the findings in that report were not going to be useful to anyone. Emmett said the findings were accurate. Curtis said accurate and useful were not always the same thing. Several people had paused in the lobby. The woman at the reception desk had stopped pretending to look at her screen. Two men in hard hats, contractors of some kind waiting for a meeting, had turned to watch without being obvious about it. Emmett said he understood the position Halcourt was in. He said he recognized that the report contained findings that complicated the expansion timeline. He said that was not something he had any control over. The west load-bearing wall of that structure had corrosion damage to 3 primary support members that predated the current ownership. The structure, as it stood, could not safely bear the additional weight of the proposed second-story addition without remediation work. That was what the calculations showed. That was what he was required to report. Curtis Halcourt let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, close enough to one that the men in hard hats exchanged a look. He said Emmett should think carefully about what he was doing. Emmett said he had thought about it carefully for 3 evenings while his daughter was asleep. He said her name was Rosalind, and then caught himself because he had not meant to say that out loud, and it surprised him that he had. He said it anyway. He said her name was Rosalind, she was 7 years old, and her mother had died 14 months ago. He said this not for sympathy. He said it because he wanted Curtis Halcourt to understand that he was not there out of carelessness or naivety. He was there because it was the 14th, and because his name was going on that report, and because he was the kind of man who needed to be able to look at himself in the mirror when he got home. Curtis Halcourt stared at him. Then he turned to the woman at the reception desk and said to call building security. There were 2 of them. Private security, not police, though the police came later. They came across the lobby at a pace that said this was routine, that they had done this before, that the marble floors and the glass walls and the pale stone had seen scenes like this one and absorbed them and forgotten them. Emmett did not raise his voice. He did not move away from the desk. He stood where he was and said, clearly and to the room, that he was there to submit a contractually required document and that he wished to do so. One of the security officers told him he would need to leave the premises. Emmett said he understood, but that he wished to formally submit the document first, with a logged timestamp and the signature of a receiving staff member. The security officer said that was not going to happen today. Curtis Halcourt was still standing there. He had not moved. He was watching with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way that suggested this was less about property rights and more about something else. About the fact that a man in a good green jacket with calluses on his hands had stood in his lobby and refused to be managed. Emmett placed the manila folder on the reception desk. He placed it face up. He placed his business card on top of it and his copy of the signed services agreement beside it. He said to the woman at the desk, not to the security officers, not to Donahue, not to Curtis Halcourt, He said to her, quietly, that the document was submitted at 3:28 in the afternoon on the 14th, and that he would note that in his own records, and that he hoped she would note it in hers. She looked at the folder. She did not pick it up, but she did not look away from it either. The security officers walked him out. Curtis Halcourt, in the moment just before Emmett reached the door, said something to the men in hard hats. It was low enough that Emmett could not make out the words, but the laugh was audible. It was the kind of laugh that is meant to be heard. Emmett sat in his truck in the parking lot for about 4 minutes. He was not crying. He was not shaking. He was doing the thing he had learned to do in the months after Ellen died. The thing the grief counselor had called grounding, which he had privately thought was a bit of an overly clinical word for simply sitting still and breathing until the world stopped moving too fast. He thought about the folder on the desk. He thought about the woman's eyes on it. He thought about Rosalind, who would be at his sister-in-law's place until 6, who would ask him how his day was over macaroni and cheese, who had a way of asking about his day that was so direct and so full of genuine curiosity that it sometimes gutted him. He picked up his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a lawyer in Sudbury named Margaret Odieno, who had done some contract work for him before, and who, when he described what had happened, said 3 words, "Send me everything." The second call was to an inspector he had worked with at the Ministry of Labor, a man named Frank Delacroix, who had been in structural inspection for 22 years, and who had, during a site review 2 years ago, mentioned something to Emmett about a municipal construction file involving a Halcourt property that had been flagged and then quietly unflagged, and that had been bothering him since. Frank picked up on the second ring. Emmett said he had something Frank might want to see. The thing about the report was that it was not, on its own, remarkable. Structural deficiencies in older commercial properties were common. Remediation requirements were common. Developers pushing back on assessors was, if you asked anyone in the industry, more common than anyone liked to admit. These things happened, and most of the time they got resolved through back channels and revised scope letters, and reports that said slightly different things the second time around. What was less common was the particular combination of what Emmett's report contained and what Frank Delacroix had been sitting on for 2 years. The Kinnear Road facility had changed hands 3 times in 11 years. Each time it changed hands, a new structural assessment had been commissioned. Each of those assessments was on file with the City of Sault Ste. Marie's Permits and Inspections Office. Emmett had obtained copies of the 2 previous ones, as he was entitled to, as they were public documents, and had read them carefully, as he always did, before conducting his own site visits. The first assessment from 14 years ago had flagged the west wall. The second assessment from 6 years ago had not mentioned the west wall at all. Emmett had found this curious at the time. He had noted it in his preliminary summary. Halcourt's team had not flagged this as a concern in their response to the preliminary. They had simply said his conclusions were not aligned with the project direction. But Frank Delacroix, when Emmett described the discrepancy over the phone, went quiet for a long moment and then said, slowly, that was interesting, because the engineer who had signed off on the second assessment, the one that did not mention the west wall, was a man named Peter Varga, who had had his designation reviewed by Professional Engineers Ontario 3 years ago following a complaint from an unrelated project. And the complaint, the one that had triggered the review, had come from a municipality. Not this one, another one. And the file had been settled quietly, and Varga's designation had been maintained, and the matter had been closed. But Frank had made a note of it, because that was the kind of man Frank was. And 2 of Halcourt's other properties had also used Peter Varga for structural assessments in the past decade. Margaret Odieno filed a formal notice of breach against Halcourt Properties within 48 hours of Emmett's call. The notice cited the refusal to accept a contractually required deliverable, the physical removal from the premises before submission could be logged. and the verbal indication from Curtis Halcourt that the report's findings were considered unacceptable prior to review, which Margaret, in her careful and precise legal language, described as an attempt to condition acceptance of a professional assessment on its conclusions rather than its methodology, which raised questions she intended to pursue. She also filed a formal request with the city's Permits and Inspections Office for a review of all active Halcourt building permits against current structural assessments on file. This was her right. It was a matter of public record. It was the kind of request that, in a quiet city, might have been quietly accommodated or quietly delayed, except that Frank Delacroix had, by that point, also submitted an internal memo to his supervisor at the Ministry of Labor flagging the discrepancy between the 2011 and 2019 structural assessments for the Kinnear Road facility, with a note about the assessor's file, and had attached 3 other Halcourt properties where Varga's sign-offs appeared on record. The memo moved faster than schmemos usually did. Emmett did not know most of this was happening. He went home. He picked up Rosalind from his sister-in-law's. She had, as she often did, drawn something at the kitchen table while she waited, a house with a red roof and a large tree, and under the tree a man and a small girl, and above the man and the girl, in careful uneven letters, the words, "My dad can fix anything." He put it on the fridge. He made macaroni and cheese. She asked how his day was. He said it had been a long one, but that he thought he had done the right thing, which was sometimes how you knew a day had been worth something. She asked if the right thing had worked. He said he didn't know yet. She thought about this with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to questions that adults consider unanswerable, and then said that the right thing usually worked eventually, she thought, because her teacher said so. He said he hoped her teacher was right. He did the dishes. He read to her from the book they had been working through. A story about a girl who repairs a broken lighthouse with her grandfather, and when she fell asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and spent an hour and 40 minutes writing a detailed account of everything that had happened at Halcourt Properties, time-stamping it and emailing it to Margaret Otieno and to himself. He was a man who documented things carefully. It was the habit, more than anything, that would matter most in what came next. The city's permits review began on a Thursday. By the following Wednesday, it had expanded in scope. A senior inspector at the city office, a woman named Carol Basque, who had been in the role for 16 years and who, colleagues said, had the professional memory of a court reporter, flagged a pattern in 3 Halcourt developments from the past decade. In each case, a structural assessment had been filed, a permit had been approved, and subsequent site inspections had noted issues that the initial assessment had not flagged. In each case, those issues had been addressed after the fact, through amendments and supplementary sign-offs, and in each case the development had proceeded. What Carol Basque noted was that in each case the initial assessment bore Peter Varga's signature. She submitted a referral to Professional Engineers Ontario. She also submitted a separate referral to the Ontario Securities Commission, because 2 of the 3 Halcourt developments had involved public financing instruments, small bond offerings to private investors, and the representations made in those offerings had included structural assessment certifications as part of the due diligence package. The second referral was the one that changed the tenor of the situation entirely. Emmett found out about the OSC referral not from Margaret, who learned about it 2 days later, but from Gord, one of his fabricators, who had seen something on the local news feed on his phone during a lunch break and had shown it to Phil, and then texted Emmett a screenshot with the message, "Buddy, is this about that thing you were dealing with?" The screenshot was a brief item from the SaltStars website. It said only that the Ontario Securities Commission had confirmed it had received a referral related to a construction and development company operating in Northern Ontario and that it was reviewing the matter. It did not name Halcourt Properties, not yet, but the referral had come from the city, and the city referral had come from the permits review, and the permit's review had come from Margaret's filing, and Margaret's filing had come from the manila folder on the reception desk, which had come from 3 evenings of work at Emmett's kitchen table while his daughter slept. He sat with Gord's text for a few minutes. Then he put his phone face down on the workbench and went back to what he was doing, which was finishing a repair job on a load-bearing bracket that a client had brought in at the end of the previous week. He did it carefully and correctly, and took a little longer than strictly necessary because he wanted it right. Margaret called on a Friday afternoon. She said the situation had developed in ways she had not fully anticipated when she filed the breach notice, and that she wanted him to understand the scope of what was now in motion so he could make informed decisions going forward, she said. Professional Engineers Ontario had opened a formal review of Peter Varga's designations. She said the city had frozen 3 active Halcourt building permits pending the outcome of their structural assessment review. She said the Ontario Securities Commission had made contact with Halcourt's legal team. She said Curtis Halcourt had, through his own lawyers, reached out to her office to discuss a resolution. Emmett asked what kind of resolution. Margaret said they had proposed full payment of the outstanding contract amount, a written acknowledgement that the structural assessment had been duly submitted and received, and a settlement figure she described as notable. Emmett asked if there were conditions attached. She said yes, a non-disclosure agreement covering the events of the 14th. He was quiet for a moment. He said he needed to think about it. She said she would give him the weekend, and that in her experience, and she had considerable experience, when the other party moved this quickly to settle, it was because they already knew what a full investigation was going to find. She said that was not legal advice. She said it was just something she had observed. He said he understood. He thanked her and hung up. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and thought about Ellen, who had been the kind of person who believed instinctively that the right course of action was also, in the long run, the practical one. She had said this to him once, very specifically, during a disagreement about a client who had shorted him on a job payment and whom Emmett had been inclined to let go because the legal hassle did not seem worth it. She had said, "Emmett, doing the right thing is almost always also the right business decision. You just have to give it enough time." He had gone after the client. He had recovered the full amount plus interest. He thought about the NDA. He thought about the manila folder on the desk and the woman's eyes on it. He thought about the 3 other Halcourt properties and the investors who had put money into bond offerings based on certifications that someone, somewhere, had reason to question. He called Margaret back on Saturday morning. He said he would not sign the NDA. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had thought he might say that. The investigation that followed was the kind that does not move quickly, because nothing that involves multiple provincial agencies and a legal team of Curtis Halcourt's caliber moves quick. It moved at the pace these things move, with referrals and reviews and hearings and the slow accumulation of documentation, but it moved. The permit freeze on the 3 Halcourt developments held through the winter. Peter Varga's designation was suspended pending the PEO review. 2 of the investors in the Kinnear Road bond offering filed a civil complaint through their own legal counsel. A reporter from a Northern Ontario business publication obtained, through Freedom of Information requests, the correspondence between the city's permits office and Halcourt Properties over the previous 6 years, and wrote a piece that was careful and factual and did not make claims it could not support, but that laid out a timeline with enough precision that anyone reading it could follow the thread. Curtis Halcourt gave no public statement. Brendan Donahue gave one brief comment to a reporter, which was that Halcourt Properties had always operated in full compliance with applicable regulations and was cooperating with any relevant reviews. Emmett drove past the Kinnear Road facility on a Sunday in February, on his way back from taking Rosalind to a skating rink on the other side of town. The development site was quiet. The expansion scaffolding, which had gone up before the permit freeze, was still there, locked in place, not progressing. Rosalind asked what the building was. He said it was a warehouse. She asked why no one was working on it. He said sometimes things had to stop for a while before they could go forward the right way. She accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has spent 14 months watching her father figure out how to keep going after something impossible happened, and who has observed that he generally does, in fact, keep going. She pressed her face against the window briefly, and then turned back to the question she had been asking before they drove past, which was whether they could have hot chocolate when they got home. He said they could. Margaret called in March with the final terms. Halcourt Properties settled the breach of contract claim in full. The settlement figure, which Emmett was permitted to describe only as satisfactory, was enough to cover the outstanding contract amount and a substantial additional sum that Margaret had negotiated without apparent difficulty, a fact that suggested the other party's lawyers had read the room correctly. The NDA was not part of the final agreement. Margaret had held that line. Emmett was permitted to describe the factual sequence of events if asked, and could confirm that the assessment report had been submitted on the 14th, and that the subsequent events had unfolded as they had, without being bound to silence about any of it. He considered this the most important part of the settlement. He told Gord and Phil on a Tuesday morning, before the workday started. He told them the broad shape of it, not the figures, not the legal particulars. Just that the situation had been resolved, and that the shop was going to be fine, and that he was grateful for their patience through a stretch that had been, he said, not exactly straightforward. Gord said that was an understatement. Phil said he had never doubted it would work out. Emmett said he had doubted it. He said there had been a Tuesday night in November when he had sat at his kitchen table after Rosalind was in bed and seriously calculated whether he could keep the shop running if the contract dispute dragged into the following year, and what he would have to let go first. He said it because he thought it was important to say, because pretending the doubt had not been there seemed like a small dishonesty, and he was not in the habit of those. Gord said yeah. Phil nodded. They went back to work. The drawing is still in the fridge. My dad can fix anything, in careful uneven letters, and the man and the girl under the tree with the red-roofed house beside them. Rosalind drew it on an afternoon in October when she was waiting for him to come home, not knowing where he had been or what kind of day it had been, only knowing that he would come home and that they would eat dinner and that things would, in the way they had learned together to expect, keep going. She is 8 now. She has recently become interested in how bridges work, which is either a coincidence or not, and she asks him questions about load and structure and tension that he answers as carefully as he would answer any client. She listens with her chin in her hand and the same directness she has always had, and sometimes she argues with his answers on the grounds that her teacher said something different, and he says, well, let's look at it together, and they do. He has never told her the full story of the 14th of October. She is 8. There will be time. What she knows is that he went somewhere that day with a folder of papers, and that something difficult happened, and that he came home and made macaroni and cheese and read to her about the girl and the lighthouse, and that things were complicated for a while after that, and then they were less complicated. She knows that he did not give back the folder. She asked him once why not. He said because it was the right thing to do. She thought about this for a moment, and then she said that was what her teacher said too. He said he was beginning to think her teacher was pretty smart.